the floating AA battery, HMS Alynbank, and the desperate gamble of the catapult ships. At 11:20 hours on May 27, 1942, the sky above convoy PQ-16 erupted with the roar of Juncker's 88 bombers. 35 merchant ships steaming toward Murmansk scattered as bombs began falling. On the foredeck of one vessel, a lone Hurricane fighter sat mounted on an 85-foot rail, its pilot strapped inside, waiting for the order that would send him rocketing into the air on a one-way mission. The aircraft would be lost. Probably the pilot, too. This was the calculus of 1941. Britain had no aircraft carriers to spare for convoy duty. German Focke-Wulf. 200 Condors were savaging Atlantic shipping from French bases at Bordeaux-Marignac Airport, their range of 2,000 nautical miles putting them beyond the reach of land-based fighters. The Condors could shadow convoys for hours, directing U-boats to targets, dropping bombs with impunity. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called them the scourge of the Atlantic. Between August and November 1940, they sank 90,000 tons of Allied shipping. The Admiralty's response was desperate by any measure. Take merchant vessels, mount a catapult on the bow, strap a Hurricane fighter to it, fire the aircraft into the sky with 13 cordite rockets. After the pilot engaged the enemy, he would bail out into the North Atlantic and hope someone picked him up before hypothermia set in. They called them CAM ships, catapult aircraft merchant ships. But HMS Alynbank was different. In September 1939, when the Admiralty began requisitioning vessels for conversion, they selected Alynbank from the Bankline fleet. She had been built in 1925 at Harland and Wolff's Govan Yard on the Clyde, 5,151 gross registered tons, a standard cargo steamer, built for the India and Far East trades, powered by triple expansion steam engines. Nothing remarkable about her except that she existed and was available. The conversion took months. While CAM ships retained their merchant role and civilian crews, Alynbank received full naval treatment. 4 twin mountings of QF 4-inch Mark 16 guns, high-angle directors for anti-aircraft fire, 2 quadruple pom-pom mounts, 20mm Oerlikon guns studded along her rails, radar sets, the most advanced available in 1940, a Royal Navy crew under acting Captain Henry Frederick Nash. She emerged as something the Royal Navy had never built before, an auxiliary anti-aircraft cruiser fashioned from a cargo steamer. Not a warship in the traditional sense, not a merchant ship anymore either. A hybrid created by necessity. The armament told the story. The 4-inch Mark 16 guns fired a 35-pound shell to 19,700 feet, muzzle velocity of 2,340 feet per second. In semi-automatic mode, the breech opened automatically after each shot, ejecting the spent casing. The loader rammed in the next 66.75-pound round of ammunition, and the breech closed automatically when the cartridge rim hit the ejectors. Rate of fire, 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun. 8 guns total, 160 rounds per minute if the crews maintained their rhythm. The specifications mattered because Alynbank would face an enemy that understood exactly what concentrated firepower could achieve. By May 1942, Luft Flotte 5 had refined its tactics against Arctic convoys. The Golden Comb, they called it. Junkers 88, dive bombers attacking from altitude, while Heinkel 111 torpedo bombers came in at wave top height, releasing salvos of torpedoes in line abreast formation. The defensive gunners aboard merchant ships had to split their fire between targets at 2,000 feet and targets skimming the water at 50 feet. Most merchant vessels carried a single 3 or 4-inch gun on the stern. Perhaps some machine guns? Inadequate. Convoy PQ-16 would test whether Alynbank's conversion had been worth the effort and expense. On May 21, 1942, 36 merchant ships departed Hvalfjordur in Iceland, the largest Arctic convoy yet assembled. Commodore Newell Gale commanded from one of the freighters. The convoy formed 9 columns, ships spaced 400 yards apart, a floating rectangle of targets steaming northeast toward the Barents Sea. The close escort included minesweepers and trawlers. HMS Hazard, St. Elston, Lady Madeline, Northern Spray. The French trawler retriever had to turn back after 3 days. Too slow to keep pace. On May 23, HMS Alynbank joined from Seyðisfjord along with corvettes Honeysuckle, Rosalis, Starwort, and Hyderabad. Force Q added the fleet oiler RFA Black Ranger and escort destroyer Ledbury. Submarines, Seawolf and Trident took flanking positions, a formidable escort by the standards of 1942. It would prove barely adequate. The convoy had been reported. A German spy in Reykjavik watched the ships depart and sent word. By May 25, Focke-Wulf, 200 reconnaissance aircraft had found them. The bombers would follow. This VZU-200 Condor was a converted airliner, built by Kurt Tank for Deutsche Lufthansa to fly transatlantic routes. 4 BMW 1,200 horsepower radial engines. Wingspan 107 feet 9 inches. Maximum speed 224 miles per hour at 15,750 feet. Range 2,212 miles. Endurance 14 hours. In August 1938, an FW-200 had flown non-stop from Berlin to New York in 24 hours, 56 minutes. Now they carried bombs and machine guns. The ventral gondola, originally designed for a bombardier position, held a 20mm cannon. Dorsal and beam positions mounted 13mm machine guns. The aircraft could carry 4,630 pounds of bombs on long-range missions, usually 4 250-kilogram weapons, not heavily armed by bomber standards. But the Condor's role was reconnaissance and harassment. Shadow the convoy. Report position. Drop bombs when convenient. Direct the U-boats. On May 25, the air attacks began. One ship damaged, forced to turn back under escort. The convoy pressed on. On May 26, all attacks were repulsed. That evening, U-703 put a torpedo into the Greek freighter Syros. She went down. May 27 brought the main effort. At dawn, crew aboard Alynbank counted Junkers 88s forming up to the south. 18 aircraft. Then more. Reconnaissance had done its work. The Germans knew exactly where PQ-16 steamed and exactly how many ships it contained. At Noun, the first major attack developed. Stary Bolshevik, a Soviet vessel carrying ammunition and vehicles, took a bomb hit forward. Fire broke out. Ready-use ammunition for the forward gun began cooking off, the shells detonating in their lockers. The gun mount fell through the deck into the forepeak. The crew fought the fire while under continued air attack. The French corvette Roselis assisted. Surgeon Lieutenant Robert Ransom Wallace crossed in a whaler from the destroyer Martin to evacuate 3 seriously wounded Soviet sailors. The ship resumed position, trailing a plume of black smoke that would mark her for the next 2 days. 4 bombs fell close to the Polish destroyer Garland. The first bomb exploded on contact with the sea, detonating the other 3 in a massive underwater explosion. Shrapnel swept Garland's deck. 25 crewmen killed, 43 wounded. Through it all, Alynbank's guns hammered away. The crew logged 108 attacks during the day of May 27. 108 times. Aircraft approached within range, and Alynbank's 4-inch guns opened fire. The pom-poms joined in at closer range, each quadruple mount, throwing 200 rounds per minute. The Oerlikon crews fired until their gun barrels glowed red. Acting Captain Nash conned the ship from the bridge, watching the radar plot, listening to the reports from the gun directors. No fighter cover, no place to hide, just continuous evasive maneuvering and the hammering of guns firing at attackers that came from every bearing. The 4-inch guns had their limitations. John Campbell, the naval historian, would later note they had neither long barrel life nor particularly high accuracy. The projectiles had too short a parallel section, leading to poor centering at the muzzle. Barrel life suffered. But on May 27, that didn't matter. Volume of fire mattered. Keeping the bombers at altitude mattered. Breaking up formations before they could coordinate their attacks mattered. And Alynbank achieved that. Through 3 days of sustained air attack, the concentrated anti-aircraft fire from Alynbank and the destroyer escorts disrupted German tactics. The torpedo bombers couldn't make their coordinated runs. The dive bombers faced curtains of flak at their release points. Formations scattered. Individual aircraft pressed home solo attacks instead of the golden comb that had been practiced and perfected. By evening May 27, 3 more merchant ships had been sunk, another damaged. The convoy had lost 5 ships so far with 300 miles still to run. On May 28, the attacks continued. Smaller raids. Reconnaissance aircraft maintaining contact. Bombers probing the defenses. The gun crews remained at action stations. Sleep came in snatches between attacks. Food consisted of whatever could be eaten standing at the gun mounts. May 29 brought Soviet air cover. Hurricanes from airfields near Murmansk began flying combat air patrol over the convoy. Their presence changed the dynamic immediately. German aircraft that had operated with near impunity now faced interception. The attacks diminished. On May 30, most of the convoy reached Murmansk. 8 ships detached for Arkhangelsk, escorted by the 1st Minesweeping Flotilla and Alynbank. That decision stripped PQ-16 of its most effective anti-aircraft platform, just as the convoy entered waters patrolled by German U-boats. Commander Robert Onslow, commanding the close escort, protested. His destroyer, HMS Onslow, carried the only other long-range radar. Losing both radar sets at this critical phase invited disaster. The Admiralty overruled him. The ships bound for Arkhangelsk needed protection during their passage through the Gorlo, the throat leading into the White Sea. Alynbank accompanied them. The detached section came under attack by Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers. The destroyer, Martin, could only reply with small arms fire and armor-piercing ammunition from its main guns. Alynbank fought off the attackers. The ships reached Arkhangelsk on June 1st. The after-action reports made clear what Alynbank had accomplished. Out of 36 merchant ships, 25 reached Soviet ports, 6 sunk by air attack, 1 by submarine, 3 damaged. In terms of 1942, this constituted success. 70% of the cargo delivered. Prime Minister Churchill had declared before departure that it would be worthwhile if even half the ships got through. Commander Onslow wrote in his report that despite the exemplary performance of Alynbank, most escorts were lacking in anti-aircraft firepower. He noted that one CAM ship was insufficient. The second long-range radar set aboard the CAM ship Empire Lawrence had been unserviceable throughout the voyage. Onslow recommended that convoys be furnished with more anti-aircraft weapons and ammunition, that an ammunition magazine be established at Vanga, and that an escort carrier would provide far more effective defense than the improvised systems currently available. The Admiralty agreed, but escort carriers remained in desperately short supply. The stopgap measures would continue. HMS Alynbank sailed with convoy PQ-18 in September 1942. Again, she provided anti-aircraft defense through sustained German air attacks. The escort carrier HMS Avenger accompanied this convoy, flying Sea Hurricanes that could land aboard after their missions. The combination of Avenger's fighters and Alynbank's guns created the layered defense the Arctic convoys needed. PQ-18 lost 13 of 40 ships, but the Germans lost 41 aircraft in the attacks. The conversion of merchant ships to anti-aircraft auxiliaries represented a peculiar desperation. In a war of industrial production, Britain found itself critically short of the platforms it needed most. Aircraft carriers took years to build. Anti-aircraft cruisers took years to build. COM ships could be converted in months, fitted with a catapult and a single expendable Hurricane. Auxiliary anti-aircraft ships like Alynbank could be converted in similar timeframes, packed with every available gun mount the Admiralty could spare. The CAM ship concept revealed the stark arithmetic of convoy defense. 35 merchant ships were converted. 35 Hurricanes sat on catapults during convoy passages. The pilots were RAF volunteers, men who understood they would fly their missions and then bail out into the Atlantic or the Arctic. In 2 years of operations, only 8 combat launches occurred. 8 German aircraft were destroyed. 8 Hurricanes were lost. 1 pilot died. The deterrent effect proved more valuable than the actual combat record. German reconnaissance aircraft approached with caution, knowing a fighter might suddenly appear. Bomber formations chose their attack timing more carefully. The mere presence of a Hurricane on a catapult changed enemy tactics, but the Hurricane pilots never forgot the nature of their mission. They signed ship's articles as civilian crew members under the authority of the civilian ship's master. The ship's chief engineer became responsible for the catapult. The first mate acted as catapult duty officer, responsible for firing the catapult when directed. The single Hurricane fighter would be launched only when enemy aircraft were sighted and agreement was reached using hand and flag signals between the pilot, catapult duty officer, and ship's master. The launch procedure required precision timing. The catapult consisted of an 85-foot rail along which a trolley carried the Hurricane. 13 3-inch cordite rockets propelled the trolley and aircraft over a distance of 60 feet. Launch velocity reached approximately 58 miles per hour in 1 second, using 30-degree wing flaps. The pilot could make a successful takeoff while losing minimal height. At dawn, the trolley receiving bar would be removed. Airmen started the aircraft and warmed the engine at intervals. The pilot climbed into the cockpit when enemy aircraft were reported. The ship hoisted International Flag Code F when the decision to launch had been made. CAM ships were usually stationed at the head of the outboard port column so they could maneuver into the wind for launch without disrupting convoy formation. An airman removed the safety pins, showed them to the pilot, and delivered them to the catapult duty officer. The pilot applied 30-degree flaps and 1/3 right rudder. The catapult duty officer raised a blue flag above his head to inform the ship's master of readiness to launch. The ship's master maneuvered into the wind and raised a blue flag to authorize launch. The master stood on the starboard bridge wing to avoid the catapult rocket blast, which sometimes damaged the port side of the bridge. The catapult duty officer counted to 3, waited for the bow to rise from the trough of a swell, and moved the switch to fire the rockets. The aircraft would career down the rail, rockets screaming, and stagger into the air barely above stall speed. The pilot would build airspeed, gain altitude, and attempt to intercept the enemy bomber that had prompted his launch. After combat, assuming he survived, the pilot faced the same choice every time: bail out, ditch in the sea, hope for rescue. In the Arctic, water temperature ranged from -1 to +3 degrees Celsius. Survival time measured in minutes. The convoys operated under standing orders not to stop for rescue if under attack. A destroyer or corvette might detach from escort duty to pick up the pilot, or might not, if tactical considerations prevented it. 7 pilots were recovered successfully. The fastest rescue took 7 minutes. 1 pilot was never found. This was the cost of providing convoy defense in 1941 and 1942. The Admiralty calculated that losing hurricanes and occasionally pilots was preferable to losing merchant ships laden with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, and fuel bound for the Soviet Union. The conversion of Alynbank to an auxiliary anti-aircraft ship represented a slightly less desperate approach. She retained her aircraft. Her guns could engage multiple targets continuously without the one-shot limitation of a CAM ship. But she remained a converted merchantman, vulnerable to torpedo attack, lacking the armor and compartmentalization of a purpose-built warship. After her Arctic service, Alynbank deployed to the Mediterranean. She participated in Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. In November 1942, she escorted convoys along the North African coast. Her guns engaged German and Italian aircraft over the beaches and in the approaches to Algiers. Through 1943, she continued convoy escort duties. Malta convoys, North African convoys, the accumulation of missions that kept the sea lanes open, even as U-boats and aircraft claimed ships from nearly every convoy. By June 1944, HMS Alynbank had been in continuous service for nearly 5 years. Her original steam engines, built in 1925, had logged tens of thousands of miles under conditions far harsher than the India trade for which she'd been designed. Her hull plates had been stressed by Atlantic gales, Arctic ice, and near-miss explosions. Her gun crews had fired tens of thousands of rounds. The Admiralty had a final mission for her. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed at Normandy. The invasion required artificial harbors to support the massive logistical effort. The Mulberry harbors consisted of concrete caissons and breakwaters, but also included block ships deliberately sunk to create sheltered anchorages. These block ships formed gooseberry breakwaters at the invasion beaches. HMS Alynbank was selected for this duty on June 11th, 5 days after D-Day. Alynbank was towed to a position off the Normandy coast and deliberately scuttled. She settled to the bottom, her superstructure and hull forming part of the Gooseberry 5 breakwater at Wistrium. There she rests still. The conversion of merchant ships to anti-aircraft platforms and catapult fighter carriers represented improvisation driven by industrial reality. Britain entered the war with 6 aircraft carriers. 3 were lost in 1941. Construction programs would deliver new fleet carriers, but not until 1943 and 1944. The gap between need and capability forced innovation. COM ships filled part of that gap. Auxiliary anti-aircraft ships like Alynbank filled another part. Neither system was optimal. Both were effective enough to keep convoys moving and cargoes flowing to the Soviet Union. The human cost accumulated steadily. 12 COM ships were sunk by enemy action out of 35 converted. The attrition rate stood at 34%. Every loss meant not just a ship and cargo, but the RAF crew aboard. The merchant crew, and usually the Hurricane on the Catapult. The pilots who volunteered for CAM ship duty knew the odds. They trained for 3 catapult launches from a ground installation at RAF Speak. They practiced ditching procedures in swimming pools. They received briefings on Arctic survival. Then they signed civilian articles and sailed with merchant convoys, living in passenger accommodations, eating with the ship's officers, waiting for the moment when the alarm would sound, and they would climb into a hurricane that they knew would not return. Flying Officer John Kenneth Kendall flew from the CAM ship Empire Tide. On August 3, 1941, reconnaissance, Condors, shadowed Convoy OG 71. At 0925 hours, one Condor approached to bombing range. Kendall launched. He climbed to intercept, engaged the Condor with his 8 Browning machine guns, and shot it down. He then flew toward the coast of Portugal, hoping to reach land. He ran out of fuel 17 miles from shore. He bailed out into the Atlantic. A Portuguese destroyer rescued him after 4 hours in the water. Kendall had saved the convoy from a bomber that might have sunk multiple ships. He had shot down a Condor, removing 1 aircraft and crew from the German reconnaissance force. He had survived his ditching and been rescued. By CAM ship standards, this mission was a complete success. Most missions ended differently. Most ended with the pilot bobbing in a rubber dinghy in water cold enough to kill in minutes, watching the convoy steam away, hoping one of the escorts would return. The technical limitations of the Hurricane as a catapult fighter compounded the tactical limitations. The Mark I Hurricane, the variant converted for CAM ship duty, was already obsolescent by 1941. These were aircraft withdrawn from a fighter command after the Battle of Britain, battle-weary, worn out, suitable only for secondary duties. The conversion to Sea Hurricane, Mark I-A, consisted of adding catapult spools, reinforcing the airframe to withstand the stress of rocket launch, and installing naval radio equipment. No significant performance improvements. Maximum speed still only 316 miles per hour at 17,500 feet. 8. Browning .303" machine guns. Effective against unarmored or lightly armored targets, but marginal against the heavy bombers entering German service. Against Focke-Wulf 200 Condors, the Hurricane had adequate performance. The Condor was large, slow, lightly armed. A single Hurricane could force it away from the convoy or shoot it down if the pilot achieved a good firing position. Against more capable German aircraft, the Hurricane struggled. Junkers 88 bombers could fight back effectively with heavier defensive armament. Heinkel 111 torpedo bombers operated at low altitude where the Hurricane had some advantage. But attacking them meant diving to sea level and fighting in the realm of anti-aircraft fire from both friendly and enemy ships. The tactical calculus was always unfavorable. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 mission, no possibility of landing, refueling, rearming, and flying again. The CAM ship Hurricane had a combat radius measured in minutes of flight time before the fuel gauge approached empty, and the pilot had to make his decision. Bail out now or try for those few extra minutes of patrol. Commander Onslow's assessment after Convoy PQ-16 captured the fundamental problem. 1 CAM ship was insufficient. The convoy had 36 merchant ships spread across several square miles of ocean. A single Hurricane could patrol only a fraction of that area. When German aircraft attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, the Hurricane pilot had to choose which threat to engage, knowing the others would press their attacks unopposed. HMS Alynbank provided what a CAM ship could not: sustained fire against multiple targets for extended periods. Her 8 4-inch guns and multiple automatic weapons could engage aircraft approaching from any direction. Her radar could detect threats beyond visual range. Her gun directors could coordinate fire, concentrating multiple weapons on priority targets. But Alynbank could not pursue. She could not intercept reconnaissance aircraft maintaining contact from beyond gun range. She could not provide combat air patrol over the convoy. She was a defensive platform, effective within the range of her weapons but incapable of projecting power beyond her immediate vicinity. The arrival of escort carriers in late 1942 transformed Arctic convoy operations. HMS Avenger, accompanying Convoy PQ-18, carried 12 Sea Hurricanes. These aircraft could launch, fly their missions, and land back aboard. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day. Aircraft could be maintained, repaired, rearmed between missions. The combat radius of the escort group expanded to include the range of carrier-based fighters. typically 100 miles or more from the convoy. Avenger was sunk on November 15, 1942, torpedoed by U-155 while escorting convoy KMF-1. 416 men died. The Sea Hurricanes went down with the ship. But by then, more escort carriers were entering service. The stopgap measures that had sustained convoy operations through 1941 and 1942 were being superseded by purpose-built platforms. The CAM ships continued operating on certain routes through 1943, but their primary role had ended. The auxiliary anti-aircraft ships like Alynbank transitioned to other duties. Some remained on convoy escort. Some deployed to amphibious operations. Some, like Alynbank, ended their service as block ships. The technical and tactical lessons from the CAM ship program influenced later developments. The concept of expendable aircraft launched from merchant ships was not pursued further. But the idea of providing convoy defense through improvised means remained central to Allied strategy. Merchant aircraft carriers, with flight decks built atop grain carriers and tankers, represented the next iteration. These ships could operate swordfish aircraft for anti-submarine patrol while still carrying cargo. 19 vessels were converted. They formed the backbone of convoy defense in the Atlantic until sufficient numbers of escort carriers became available. The story of HMS Alynbank and the CAM ships reveals how industrial warfare creates problems that have no good solutions, only least bad options. Britain needed aircraft carriers for convoy defense, but could not build them fast enough. The alternative was to convert merchant ships into floating anti-aircraft platforms and catapult fighters into one-way missions. The system worked. Not efficiently, not elegantly, but well enough to keep the convoys moving through the most dangerous phase of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Arctic Convoy Campaign. The ships that fought in Convoy PQ-16 delivered their cargo. 25 out of 36 vessels reached Soviet ports. The tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, and fuel they carried sustained Soviet forces during the fighting at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus. Without those supplies, Soviet resistance might have collapsed. The course of the war might have changed. HMS Alynbank fired her guns in defense of that convoy and others. Her crew manned the weapons through sustained air attacks. Through Arctic weather, through the endless stress of convoy operations, where every watch might bring contact with the enemy. When the Admiralty selected her for the Gooseberry Breakwater, they chose a ship that had given everything already. The final voyage to Normandy, the deliberate scuttling, the settling to the seabed off Ouistreham. This was simply the last service Alynbank could provide. She lies there still, hull plates slowly corroding in the tidal currents of the English Channel, a monument to the improvisation and desperation that characterized the darkest years of the war at sea. No grand ceremony marked her passing. No memorial stone records her service. She is one name among thousands on the lists of vessels lost or expended during the war. But for the men who sailed aboard her, for the convoys she escorted, for the merchant crews who watched her guns firing at incoming bombers, HMS Alynbank represented the margin between survival and destruction. She was the anti-aircraft battery that stood between them and the Luftwaffe. She was the radar set that provided warning. She was the proof that the Royal Navy had not forgotten them, even when it could spare only a converted merchantman armed with worn-out guns and obsolescent fire control equipment. The CAM ship pilots understood even more clearly what desperation meant. They flew, knowing their aircraft would be lost. They took off from a catapult mounted on a rolling deck in mid-ocean, achieved flight speed in 60 feet of rail, climbed away with marginal power, sought out an enemy they might or might not find, fought for perhaps 20 minutes, and then faced the cold mathematics of fuel remaining versus distance to land. Some made it. Most ditched. One never came back. The official histories record their missions in brief paragraphs. 8 combat launches, 8 German aircraft destroyed, 8 Hurricanes lost. The statistics convey the tactical outcome, but not the experience of the pilots who flew the missions or the merchant crews who watched the Hurricanes disappear into overcast skies and never return. The broader narrative of World War II tends toward the dramatic turning points: Midway, Stalingrad, D-Day. The story of HMS Alynbank and the CAM ships fits into the less dramatic category of sustained operational effort. Convoy after convoy, mission after mission. The accumulation of small tactical successes that ultimately made the difference between victory and defeat. Without the convoys, the Soviet Union would have received no Lend-Lease supplies beyond what could be shipped via Iran or Vladivostok. The Arctic route was the most direct, the most dangerous, and the most vital. Through 1941 and 1942, when Soviet forces were barely holding, when the outcome of the Eastern Front remained uncertain, the Arctic convoys delivered the tanks and aircraft and ammunition that kept Soviet armies in the field. Alynbank helped protect those convoys. She was not the decisive platform. She did not turn the tide single-handedly. She was one auxiliary anti-aircraft ship among dozens of escorts, firing her guns alongside destroyers and corvettes and minesweepers, all of them holding back an enemy that had the advantage of shore-based air power and interior lines of communication. But the convoys got through. Not all of them, not always without terrible losses, but enough of them reached Murmansk and Arkhangelsk to sustain the Soviet war effort through the critical months when defeat remained possible. That was the mission. Deliver the cargo, accept the losses, continue the convoys. HMS Alynbank completed her mission. She escorted the convoys through sustained attack. She brought her guns to bear against wave after wave of bombers. She provided the radar coverage and fire direction that enabled effective defense. She survived long enough to serve again in the Mediterranean and then to sail one final time to Normandy. The blockship duty that ended her career was inglorious compared to the combat of the Arctic and Mediterranean campaigns. But it was necessary. The invasion forces needed sheltered anchorages to unload supplies and reinforcements. The Gooseberry breakwaters provided that shelter. The ships that formed those breakwaters, including Alynbank, made the logistics of Normandy possible. Every aspect of the war came down ultimately to logistics. The ability to move supplies where they were needed, when they were needed, in sufficient quantities to sustain operations. Alynbank contributed to that effort from her conversion in 1940 until her scuttling in 1944. She was a platform designed for one mission, modified when requirements changed, expended when a final use presented itself. The crews who served aboard her during those years experienced a very different war from the one fought by carrier task forces or battleship squadrons. They manned a converted freighter bristling with guns, steaming through some of the most dangerous waters of the war, facing an enemy that attacked from the air in formations large enough to overwhelm any defense. They survived, most of them. They brought their ship through multiple convoys. They fired their guns until the barrels needed replacement. They maintained the equipment through Arctic cold and Mediterranean heat. They did their duty as defined by the mission orders and the tactical situation and the simple imperative of getting the convoy through. When historians assess the Battle of the Atlantic and the Arctic convoys, they focus usually on the escort carriers and the destroyers and the corvettes that fought the U-boats. HMS Alynbank and ships like her receive brief mentions if they appear at all. They were auxiliaries, improvised solutions to a temporary problem, replaced by more capable platforms as soon as production allowed, but they held the line when the line needed holding. They provided the anti-aircraft defense that kept convoys intact through the worst phase of the Luftwaffe's anti-shipping campaign. They proved that even obsolescent weapons could be effective when employed with skill and determination. The measure of their success is simple. The convoys reached their destinations. The cargo was delivered. The war continued. HMS Alynbank deserves to be remembered not as a makeshift solution or a desperate expedient, but as an example of how naval forces adapt to circumstances and accomplish their missions with whatever resources are available. She was never the best platform for the role she filled. She was simply the platform that existed when the role needed filling. That proved to be enough.